All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. This episode of the Quorum Forum is the 24 election, navigating the markets. And we have a really special guest today, and that is Kari Grant. So Kari is Vice President of Government Relations at Natixis. Her job is to be the resident expert on economic policy, on politics. And so she has a dynamite presentation. As you might guess, she is in high demand, with it being only 5 days until the election. I'm sure we all cannot wait. So I'll start by saying my name is Kelly Milligan. I am one of the managing partners at Quorum Private Wealth. I'll also start by saying Happy Halloween. And since we have we really have no tricks, but we do have this treat, and that is Kari. So without further ado, Kari, I will turn it over to you. I'll do one ado, and that is a little bit more on your background. You have had a long career in Washington, D.C., covering politics, about 15 years now, both in D.C. and London. You worked for the UK government in their embassy in Washington, D.C. Now, you and I are both wearing blue, but we are both nonpartisan in this presentation. So we're not trying to express an affiliation here. I'll just put that little disclaimer out there. But I can't wait to hear you take us through the latest on the 2024 elections and the implications for markets and policy. So Kari, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kelly, and thank you all for joining. And I'm glad you finished with that point about nonpartisanship. It's really important in the context of this presentation and the way that we try and talk about politics and policy. I think it's just helpful to take a step back and look at things from a really factual and data-driven perspective. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. And I am wearing blue simply because I look better in blue. So we're going to start with a presentation, and then we're going to have some time for Q&A. So if you think of things that you want to talk about, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. I have given this presentation dozens of times, and outside the US and inside the US, and I always get so much more from it. And I think folks get so much more from it when they're able to ask questions and make this more of a dialogue. So I would just encourage you to do that if you think of anything at any point that you want to talk about in more depth, or anything that I haven't mentioned that you're just curious about. So today I want to start by taking a step back, everything that's at stake in this election. So the House, the Senate, the presidency, and then kind of walk through the things that I'm watching that could be predictors about the election, and then put it into the context about policy. Because so much of what we're focused on right now is really the politics, and that's natural. It's an election season, but policy will flow from the election, and it's worthwhile to think about those things as well. So I do want to start here again with the basics, and I know you all know all of this, but I think it's helpful just to put it in context. So every 2 years, if you are a representative in the House of Representatives, you have to run for office. It's a tough job, and there are 435 people who are doing that. So if you live in DC like I do, you spend a lot of time with members of the House because they're constantly fundraising. And I have the privilege of spending time on the right and the left since I'm nonpartisan. Lots of folks in DC just spend time on either side. And I'll tell you, there's obviously a difference in policy between the parties and even within the parties. But one thing in common is that being a member of the House means that you constantly need to get that support from donors, but also from your constituents. And we'll talk about this, but that manifests itself in policymaking in the House too. So, if you can remember back to a time before this election when we were focused on what was happening in DC from a policymaking perspective, you would hear a lot of headlines about how things would really get slowed down in the House and that there would be a lot of division. And I think that's natural because you're constantly running for election. So you're constantly being judged and evaluated by your voters on the votes that you take. And so oftentimes you see really, really partisan votes taken in the House. Now, on the other hand, you have the Senate. So senator is a great job. You only have to run for election every 6 years. So it's even less frequent than the presidency. So what that means is that 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So you have a little more time in between your election and when you're up for re-election to kind of distinguish yourself on policy. And so you see a lot more compromise in the Senate and a lot more bipartisan work. And then, of course, it's a presidential election year, as if we could forget. But it's a notable one because if you'd watched me give this presentation in January or in June or now, of course, the presentation would have been very different. In January, everyone was convinced that this was going to be a rematch, even though that hadn't been decided yet. You know, Trump had not yet won the nomination. In June, it was still a rematch up until the debate. And then, of course, everything changed after the debate. So I do want to talk a little bit about maybe why this year has felt very anxiety producing and strange for all of us, because it really has been unusual. And again, I know we've all lived this, but I think it's worth just sort of walking through the events one after the other. So the first and maybe what I thought might have been the most unusual event until we kept moving through the year was just how long this election has been. And I know it's felt that way to you, but ordinarily, when you have a contested ticket, so an open primary where you don't have an incumbent, which was the case on the Republican side, you wouldn't know who the candidate was going to be until May, maybe June. It takes a while for there to be enough support from the primary process for that person to become a clear winner. This year, that was decided on March 5th, Super Tuesday. So, you know, the election is on November 5th next week. That means from the beginning to the end of this election, we had 8 months of a general election process. It's the longest general election in our country's history. So we're living in a moment of history just by the length of this election. And then, of course, everything changed again in June. So, you know, ordinarily, both candidates agree to the convention on debates. 3 debates are organized, and they tend to happen later in the year, partly because that primary process lasts so long. Now, this time, Biden and Trump, neither of them wanted to do the ordinary debates and agreed instead to negotiate their own terms. Among those terms was that the first debate would be held historically early on June 27th. So that debate really did change everything. You know, I think afterwards, I received lots of inbound questions about whether or not Biden would drop out of the race. And as you'll hear me say so often today, I don't know. And that was my answer at the time because, you know, taking a step back, Biden has been in politics for a very long time. The first time he ran for president was 1988. So, you know, it takes a really long time to achieve the office of the presidency. And there was no real assumption amongst insiders in DC that he would then drop out of the process even after that debate. And as you'll remember, June 27th is the week before the 4th of July. And DC, like many cities in the US, really closes down that week. Congress leaves, people go on vacation. I myself went to the UK, and maybe ironically this year, they were holding their election on July 4th. But I saw as much about the US election in London as I saw about their own election. So what did that tell me? It meant that, you know, the debate was not going away. The problem of the debate for the Biden campaign was really just not going to dissipate. And so once everybody returned to DC the following week, you know, that became even more clear. And ultimately, Biden made the decision to drop out of the race just 3 weeks later. Amidst all of that, we had the first presidential assassination attempt in over 40 years. And then since then, there's been a second assassination attempt on the former president. And of course, we've had other debates. So I don't loop all those things together because one is not more significant. Of course, you know, an assassination attempt is, you know, dreadful and something that, you know, we've become too familiar with in this cycle. But I do loop them together because so often I get asked, okay, well, this happened, so now what? Or there's this debate, and so now, you know, what does that mean for the election? Isn't this like a changing moment, and doesn't this mean one person is certainly going to win now? And, you know, I've been asked that as things about as silly as Taylor Swift's endorsement of Kamala Harris. What does this mean for the race? And again, I hate to say this again and again and again, but I don't know. And anyone else really doesn't know. You know, you watch after the assassination attempt, or you watch after a debate to see if the polls shift, and if they shift meaningfully, and if they shift consistently. And what was hard in this election is because there were so many changing events that you almost couldn't see the impact of one, because as soon as something happened, something else happened. Now, that said, there will be people who examine the election retroactively and say, okay, well, this was clearly a change moment. We see that in the past. One of the other things I was asked about was the hurricanes that tragically struck the Southeast. And there have been election-changing momentum from hurricanes. We saw that in 1992 with Hurricane Andrew. President H.W. Bush lost re-election and was widely seen not to have handled that hurricane particularly well. George W. Bush saw a benefit in 2004 from the way he handled a hurricane in Florida, where his brother was governor. Obama saw some benefit to the way he handled the hurricane in 2012, Hurricane Sandy. So it does matter. These events do matter, but it's just so hard to know ahead of time how they impact the electorate. And so I talk about all of these things because people want to know what they mean. And also we're feeling really uncertain. And it's no wonder, you know, with all the things that I've just talked through, why we're feeling so uncertain. So I want to walk through some things that there's a little more certainty around and that could tell us the trajectory of the race for the White House. And I want to start with one of 5 factors, the first, which is the issues. So I'm often asked, what's the top issue, and won't this tell us who's going to win the election? And I can tell you what the top issue is, but I don't think I can tell you who's going to win the election because of the top issue. And here's why. So the economy and inflation are the top issue. You can see here that it benefited Trump versus Biden before Biden dropped out. And then just after Biden dropped out, it benefited Trump versus Harris. And it has consistently benefited Trump over Harris. But that said, you know, there are other issues on voters' minds. So abortion, healthcare, crime, immigration, and Harris leads on a number of these issues. So if I could tell you who the swing voters are and what their top issue is, perhaps I could tell you who's going to win the election. But without knowing that, it's impossible to say that just because Trump is leading on the economy and the economy is the top issue nationally, that he'll win, because of course we don't have a popular vote system. And so the top issue is not always the one that decides the election. And so I did want to dig into that a little bit more. Again, I've talked to people all across this country in person and virtually. And one of the things that I've noticed is you hear from different people, very different perspectives on what matters to them. And so I wanted to find some data that either backed that up or contradicted that. And so I looked for a series of surveys and found this one from the Pew Research Center. It's a nonpartisan sociological political research organization. And it's really interesting that Republicans and Democrats have very different views on what government should be working on right now. So you can see here, Democrats are much more likely to say that the government should be working to solve climate change and the environment right now. Republicans are much more likely to say the same about immigration. What this doesn't tell you is that there are no Democrats who care about immigration or there are no Republicans who care about the environment. Far from it. Of course, everyone has their issues that they care about, and it's not neatly aligned with party, but there are meaningful differences. And I found that interesting. And I wanted to, again, dive a little deeper into why that might be the case.
Hey, Kari,
So again,
can I interrupt you and ask a question there?
Oh, sure.
On that last chart, seems to me that there would be significant regional sensitivity to a chart like this. Like if you're on a border state like Arizona or Texas or New Mexico, immigration might be your number one issue. If you're in a state like Louisiana or Florida, climate change, that might be your number one issue.
And that's true.
Is that true?
Yeah, we see that in polls, but again, what's hard about that is even if it's the top line issue in those states, the question is, who is it the top issue for? So like if the swing voters are 4 to 5% of the population, do they agree with the vast majority of that population that immigration or climate changes? And so it's just, there's no granular data, and it's so hard to reach those swing voters on what their top issue is. So there are certainly regional differences, and you would probably see more crossover from people in different parties based on their region. But the real challenge is just what are the swing voters caring about? Because, you know, as much as, you know, every vote does count and, you know, everyone should go out and vote in this election, at the same time, those swing voters are the ones who are going to determine the election. And it's just very hard to know what their top issue is.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's kind of what this suggests, which is that this is another study by Pew. It asks people a series of questions about their party ideology, the way they see the world, a series of issues, and then it kind of groups them into a worldview. And it's not associated with either party. And then they looked based on party, are there meaningful alliances? The world, and what they found was 70% of Republicans have ideologically more conservative views and 70% of Democrats have ideologically more liberal views. Now, that said, the general population you can see here is basically a rainbow coalition of worldviews. We all see the world very differently. And so those swing voters are probably somewhere in those middle bands in that chart. And so they're the ones who we need to know what their top issue is to convince them to vote for a candidate in an election. And so what you see here in this other chart is the cost of doing that. So it is so expensive as a presidential candidate to find those voters, to figure out what they care about, and then to develop messaging that will work for them. And that's the real secret to winning election, is finding those persuadable voters and getting them off the couch and getting them excited to vote for your candidate. And so I'm often asked, well, how do you end up with these two candidates? And I've been asked that from folks overseas. And of course, that's one person's point of view. But my answer is simply that it's hard to run for office, both in setting up a compelling campaign, but also in funding it. So you can see here, running for the presidency costs almost as much as running for all 435 House seats and all 33 Senate seats put together. And all of this is just at trying to figure out what is the issue that will get the persuadable voters off the couch. And so to put a finer point on the issues, it's not as simple as an issue polling nationally. It's really much more nuanced than that. And it's very difficult to find those voters.
Well, that is a sad chart on the right. Any prediction for 2024?
It will far outpace any other presidential election year. And I haven't seen the final figures, but the Harris campaign has suggested that they raised themselves over $1 billion in just one quarter. And that is, you know, quite a lot of money. So moving on to the second factor, and I know you're going to see this page and think, well, it looks like there's a pretty compelling lead, but I want to just ask you to take a step back and think about this chart a little differently. So I hear a lot from folks that they don't trust the polls, and with good reason. Over the last two elections, the presidential elections, they underestimated Trump's support from anywhere from 3 to 6%. So that's meaningful in a race that's very, very close. Polls are not designed to be perfect. There is always a margin of error. It's impossible to get an exact answer on where people are. And the other thing about it is, even if someone answers a poll and they really mean that they prefer Trump or they prefer Harris, it doesn't mean that they're going to go out and vote. So some of this is about motivation as well. So if you look at this chart, the margin of error is about 4%. Even this close to an election, state level data is not as reliable as national level data. It's harder to get a representative sample. And there are all sorts of pollsters who are trying to figure out how to get the most accurate answer. So if you ask me, looking at this, this is a dead heat. You know, Arizona and Georgia are looking a little more compellingly in the Trump camp, but the other races may as well be a tie. And if you look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that is the key to Harris winning the White House. She wins those 3 states. She gets exactly 270 electoral votes, which is what you need to win the White House. Now, if you're Trump, you want to take one of those states because you need one of those states, and it also gives, you know, eliminates that path for Harris. So another question I'm often asked is, why did, you know, J.D. Vance become the nominee, or why did Tim Walz become the VP nominee? And my answer is simply they're from the Midwest, and that seemed compelling to both campaigns. And so I just want to encourage you, if you're following the polls day to day, one, you know, we're 5 days out, so you don't have to drive yourself crazy doing that. And also, you're not likely to see a material difference in the numbers that we're seeing today. I follow these every morning, every afternoon. As soon as polls come in, I look at them, and we're not seeing huge shifts. So Trump did gain some momentum in October. He was behind in, I want to say, 5 or 6 of these states in September. He's made up some of that momentum, but it's kind of steady now. And so it's steady at basically a tie. And the real question that I have, and that will be answered again after the election, is did they correct for the bias against Trump voters from previous elections? And that is really the million-dollar question. Again, if I could answer it, I'll tell you who's going to win the election. I think pollsters will have tried to do that because they don't want to be wrong. They have every incentive to be right, because every time a pollster's right, they get a lot of credit, a lot of notoriety. They can create their own sort of website and get lots of attention. And so I think they're going to try and drive towards a better and more accurate result. And if that's the case, then these are essentially tied races.
Kari, beyond looking at this poll data, is there any significance or insight to be gleaned from looking at betting sites?
Yeah, so betting sites are interesting and new in the context of this election, and not something that we've talked about as political pundits in the past. And they're certainly favoring Trump at this point. And you're starting to see some of that actually be forecast into markets as well, and the way that they're reacting to the election. I think it's the first time that this has been notable, and it's going to be skewed if there are big bets being placed in either direction. So I don't personally put a lot of stock in the betting markets. To me, the betting markets are kind of about gut feeling, and we'll see if those folks who are betting are right in their gut. But I don't think that. I'd much rather look at polling data, which is more scientific than people's persuasion.
Mm-hmm. Not something you're studying then.
No, I'm following it, but I just, if it's accurate this year, then I'll be following it much more closely in 2028. But this is kind of a level setting year for me with betting markets, and call me skeptical about their accuracy.
Well, it's also the first time I can recall that a publicly traded stock has the initials of a political candidate and is closely tied to his political fortunes. That's
exactly right. Yeah, and we're seeing that in the lead up to the election, and much more certainty, at least for the folks who are taking a bet on that stock, by feeling that Trump's odds have really, really increased. Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit here is turnout, and people are obsessing right now about turnout and whether or not you can glean anything from that. Republican turnout is up in Nevada and Arizona. Democratic turnout is up in some caution there, because we don't know if people are turning out for their party and then voting for that candidate, or if they're turning out to vote and not voting for that candidate. So, and we're in a different environment than we were in 2020 as well, where many more people were voting early due to the pandemic. So again, don't obsess over those figures. The swing states to me are really, really a tie. And I, again, was giving a very different presentation in June and August than I am giving now, talking about third-party candidates. RFK was really seen as a big third-party candidate. Now, a third-party candidate was never going to win our election, and never really will, in at least our modern politics, unless something significantly changes, but they can change an election. So RFK was polling about 10% in some of these states, and it seemed to be that he was taking from Biden, and then Biden dropped out, and then it seemed to be that he was taking from Trump, and then RFK dropped out and endorsed Trump. So all of us were really expecting to see a big bump for Trump, who were watching the polls really closely. And it didn't really materialize very clearly. And that could have been because of the confluence of events that were happening around the same time. So today, third-party candidates are polling between 2 and 4% in swing states. Now, third-party candidates tend to poll twice the amount that they actually get on election day. So people get in the polling booth and they say, I'm going to change my vote. I want it to matter. I'm going to change to one of the two candidates or not vote. So I expect that third-party candidates will draw between 1 and 2% of the vote this year at a maximum. And that will be split between a number of candidates. It depends on what state you're in. Some states have as many as like 10, 12 third-party candidates, some of whom you would have never heard of. Others just have 2 or 3. There's been a lot of talk about whether Jill Stein will steal votes from Harris in Michigan, because there was the uncommitted vote in the primary process, and a number of Arab American voters who are dissatisfied with the current administration's policy in Israel. It seems to me that it is possible for Jill Stein to take some of that vote, but RFK is also still on the ballot in Michigan. So he tried to file to get off the ballot in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He was successful in Pennsylvania. It actually delayed the mail out of ballots, but he wasn't successful in Michigan or Wisconsin. And so my expectation is that in a lot of these states, it's going to be a bit of a wash where third-party candidates are and who they take from. And you can kind of see here that it does not materially change, at least in these early polls, the lead. So I think third-party candidates matter less in this election. But again, hindsight will be 2020. And if there's a real difference, I think you'll need to look at Michigan and Wisconsin to see how Jill Stein has done there. And then the fourth factor, and this is my favorite because it's a little more fun. It's the I'd like to have a beer with this candidate factor. And people have always talked about that. Like, you know, I like that guy, I like that gal. I could see myself spending time with them. And if you were in office and you were a president, you knew you could not win re-election with favorability below 50%. Why 50%? Well, that seemed to be a magic number. And what it means is that not only does your party like you, but independents might like you and the other party might like you. Well, if there's one thing I will tell you certainly in this presentation, maybe the only fact I can absolutely give you is that whoever wins is going to have underwater favorability. They will have less than 50% of the country who likes them. And that's really a symbol of our time. So no one really wants to have a beer with these candidates. And another factor I would tell you here is, while it looks like an advantage for Harrison Walz, on the Trump side, his favorability is actually higher now than it was in 2016. And so with that in mind, I asked this question, does favorability matter? Because it has mattered for such a long time. But, you know, if it doesn't matter in this election, I think we might be in a postmodern political era where favorability just doesn't really matter. It's more about who you like less than who you actually like. And then the final factor is turnout. And I mentioned this earlier, people are obsessing over turnout. You know, early in person and early mail-in voting is down from 2020. That's to be expected. That was an unusual time. There were states with much more permissive voting rules to try and keep people safe and help them vote from home. And some of that has changed in this electoral cycle. And a lot of people like to vote in person, and some people choose to vote on election day. So I expect that we will have lower turnout in the early vote. That said, we could still have record or near record turnout overall, but some of that and much more of that might happen on election day. So then the question becomes, is it just Republicans and Democrats who turn out because that's a base election, or do we see independents and moderates turn out? And I ask this because in a base election, it seems to me that Republicans would have a slight edge. And here's why. So we have an electoral college system, as I mentioned earlier. The first and only person to eclipse 270 becomes our president. In the last 25 years, the only candidates who have done that without winning the popular vote have been Republican candidates. So George W. Bush in 2000 and then Donald Trump in 2016 won the electoral college vote, but they didn't win the popular vote. And so based on a base election, just because the slight advantage for the Republican candidate, I think that would give a slight edge to Trump. Now, in a high turnout election, I don't think that gives either candidate an edge necessarily, because we're not sure who those independent voters are turning out for just yet. But if history is going to repeat itself, over the last two elections, independents have turned to Democrats over Republicans. And so a high turnout election is probably Harris's best chance of winning the White House. It does not eliminate the chance for Trump, but it does give her more of a chance than I think a base election does.
Kari, is there a reason why we're still doing the whole electoral college thing? I mean, we can count the popular vote now accurately.
Yeah, so it would take an act of Congress to overturn that, and you would need to have a significant majority in Congress to do that, because it would require a constitutional amendment. So I don't foresee that happening. And there is talk of it, of course. You hear that from candidates mostly on the left because of this historical advantage that we've seen on the Republican side. But I do think in this election, so historically, the reason why Republicans haven't had an advantage is that blue states are very, very blue. So, you know, a Democrat will win New York, which is a highly populated state, or California, by 30 points. So that delivers them, you know, a huge popular vote tranche. Whereas Republicans have won red states by smaller margins and their lower populations, but they won more states. increasingly Republicans are winning red states by bigger margins. And so considering they'll win more states and they're winning them by bigger margins, I think you're going to start to see the popular vote coming in closer in line with the Electoral College vote over time, unless our partisanship starts to improve. And that might sound like a good thing, but actually it means we're even more divided than we've ever been. And red states are redder than they've ever been, and blue states are bluer than they've ever been. And so I don't foresee it going anywhere. And I also think that our system is changing a little bit, and we might see less and less of people winning one and not the other. So I know that it is tempting to spend all our time talking about the presidency because we can't get away from it, but I do want to talk a little bit about Congress because it matters a lot. So of course, everything like tax policy, foreign aid, debt, and spending all comes through Congress. Now, Democrats have a really, really tough math this year in the Senate. So as you may know, there are 51 Democrats in the Senate, 49 Republicans. Actually, there are 48 Democrats and 3 independents who caucus with Democrats, but that gives Democrats a majority. And as you can see here, Democrats have a lot of people running for office. Now, bear in mind, the last time these people won election was 2018. So that was the year or the off-year election right after Trump had won the White House. That is always a tough year for the president's party because it's almost a referendum on the president, and people, tend to vote against that in that off year. So Democrats had a very good year in 2018. So now that's come home to roost, and they have to support those races. And as you can see, the only names that are highlighted are the most competitive races. So Republicans don't have any really, really competitive races. Now I'll get to one in a minute that could be competitive, but there are so many more on the Democratic side, and Republicans only need to pick off 2 seats to retake the chamber. So I think it's almost a certainty that Joe Manchin's seat will go to Republicans because he is retiring and he is a Democrat in a very, very red state. So his seat will go to Republicans. And John Tester is polling behind Tim Sheehy, his opponent in Montana, by about 6 points on average, and that is outside the margin of error. And Tester's never polled behind his opponent. He's always been very popular in his home state. So it seems like Tester is also likely to lose his seat. And so Republicans only need to take 1 more seat to get to 52 to exceed the margin Democrats have now, but I think they will at least get to 51. Now, the other seats that are up for election are also worth watching on election night. So if you're watching Tammy Baldwin's seat, Bob Casey's seat, and Debbie Stabnow's seat, those are all swing states. What you're seeing right now is Bob Casey has never really had a problem running for election in Pennsylvania. His name is, golden in that state. His father was the governor. Everybody knows him very well. In fact, some people confuse him for his father when he's running for Senate, who his father was once the governor. And so he's never really had a challenge. But in this election, his race is very much narrowed in the last couple of weeks. And that's a warning sign at the top of the ticket as well. So if Bob Casey's able to hold on to his seat, that will also be helpful to Harris in Pennsylvania. If McCormick is able to flip it, that's going to be a good sign for Trump. So watch those races. That should also give you a clearer sign of the presidency as well. And so the one race I do want to call out on the Republican side is Ted Cruz's seat. Ted Cruz, last time again he ran was 2018, and he ran against Beto O'Rourke. It was a campaign that Democrats put a lot of money into, but ultimately Cruz won pretty convincingly. He's in a really, really tough race. He's running against Colin Allred, who is a former football player, NFL football player, and is just very popular in the state. And Allred is really within the margin of error against Cruz. So I think it is possible Cruz could lose his seat. I think it's improbable, just because I think Trump at the top of the ticket will carry Cruz. So looking at the Senate, it's looking like Republicans are going to take control. On the opposite side of Capitol Hill, I would say the House is the complete opposite situation. So Republicans currently have a majority there, a 4-seat majority. Very handily, Democrats' phrase in this election is 4 in 24, which is helpful. It's easy to remember. So they only need to flip 4 seats. You can see here, there are more Republicans in close or toss-up races. There are also 3 times as many Republicans who are sat in seats that Joe Biden carried in 2020 versus Democrats who are in seats that Donald Trump carried in 2020. So I think Democrats have a pretty good chance of taking the House. Now, I'm not as convinced of that as the Senate. If I gave Republicans a 70-75% chance of the Senate, I'd give Democrats a 55-60% chance of the House. So base case here, really, we're looking at divided government, which of course markets really like. It means that it takes a long time to make policy. It also means, as people who consume policy information, that we are going to be stuck waiting for information for a very long time. So next year, you know that Congress is going to be working on tax policy. The TCJA, which was passed in 2017, included a number of individual tax cuts, but it also included corporate tax cuts. Well, it was passed through reconciliation. And if you pass anything through reconciliation, it has to be budget neutral within the 10-year window. So what that meant was they could not make those individual tax cuts permanent. So all of those will expire at the end of 2025 unless Congress does something. So that means the estate tax exemption, the gift tax, they will all go back to their pre-tax cut levels. And you know, withholding rates, standard deductions, all will go back before 2017 levels indexed for inflation. So we would see a lot of tax increases on individuals, and corporate tax rates would remain the same. So as you can imagine, that's a tough message if you're in Congress to say, I'm going to keep corporate tax rates low, I'm going to raise individual tax rates. So my expectation is that even the corporate tax rates will be up for negotiation. And so in a divided government, you'll see them trying to balance their constituents' interests as well as, you know, our economy and businesses' interests. And so ultimately, it is going to take a very long time for Congress to agree on any set of tax cuts. And it is possible, as Congress always does, that they just kick the can down the road and that they just extend them for another 2 years and try again in 2026.
Or let them all expire.
Or possibly let them all expire. You know, and one of the interesting things, just going back to that slide, one of the tax cuts that was really not popular in states like California and New York was the SALT cap. So the state and local income tax deduction was capped at $10,000, and that was very unpopular. So that unites Republicans and Democrats from those states. So whoever wins the House is going to owe it to California or New York members. And those people are, you know, it's basically a game of chicken. They might want to see the tax cuts expire so that they can get that SALT cap eliminated, because that would also expire at the end of 2025. So there's going to be a lot of leverage in the hand of either Democrats or Republicans from California and New York. So that will be an interesting dynamic that will play out in the middle of the tax debate. And then I just want to finish here before we move into open Q&A, which is just that, you know, again, this has been an emotional election. We feel a lot of tumult, but of course we know the market is politically agnostic, and it reverts to the fundamentals after the election. Even in the lead up to election, if we're seeing volatility, that will sort of peter out. So just want to encourage folks to keep that in mind in this sort of tumultuous last week of the election, to just sort of assuage fears that, you know, we've seen every form of government, and investing continues to be a really good option.
Good to hear from an investment standpoint that political fortunes in the short run don't really affect people's long-term economic prosperity or not, and certainly shouldn't affect their long-term goals and how they set up to achieve those goals.
Absolutely.
So Kari, if you're done with your presentation, let's open it up for Q&A. See if folks have questions. Go ahead and drop a question into the Q&A dialog box, and we'll get those to Kari as they come in. But while we're waiting, I have a few questions for you. First is, you know, we're all ready for November 5th. Can't get here soon enough, but are we really going to know the answer November 5th?
Yeah, so what is knowing the answer? So I want to walk through what that means a little bit. So if you watch the election, and I know we all do, you will hear on election night, let's say in New York, the polls close, and you hear within 15 minutes that the race has been called for Kamala Harris, right? That might happen. That often happens in elections, and that's because the AP will call a race when the path to victory for a candidate is so narrow that it's impossible. So it doesn't mean that the election has been decided. It doesn't mean that the state has counted all its votes. But if enough votes have been counted and the outlying votes that remain will not favor that candidate, they call a race. So while that's easier in a really blue state like New York or in a really red state like Oklahoma, where they might call it really quickly, in a swing state, that takes time, right? So if you remember last election, and who can forget, we were all locked inside. It was a tough time in 2020. And we didn't hear until Saturday that Pennsylvania had been called. But that didn't mean Pennsylvania was done counting the votes. That didn't mean that there were not challenges in that state or that we knew the exact total of votes. What it meant was the AP had determined that there was no path to victory for Donald Trump with the votes outstanding. So when you think about calling a race, we will know that, I think, within days of the election. When we know about the final vote totals and whether or not there are other challenges, it depends on how close the race is. And either candidate is well within their legal bounds to challenge a race or to ask for a recount of a race until those methods are exhausted. That might take, weeks. But I do think we'll start to see signs, and we will start to see races be called more quickly this time. So I just want to walk through a couple signs to watch. So if you're following the early results and you're like me and you want to go to sleep, although I know I'll be up all night, that's my job. But if you're on the East Coast or you want to follow the East Coast time, North Carolina counts their votes really early. They count them quickly. Florida counts their votes really quickly. Georgia will probably count their votes really quickly. If Harris has a lead in the early votes, which come out first, that's good for her. She needs that because Democrats tend to vote early more often than Republicans. If Trump has a lead in the early vote, that's the early warning sign for Harris. So watch those early vote totals from North Carolina and Georgia in particular, and you'll have a good sense of what the call might be later. And you'll hear that in the coverage if you watch one of those people who, go to the map and talk about all the counties. They'll start talking about it pretty early in the night, and that'll give you a sense of the trajectory of the race, even if it takes days to weeks for everything to be over. We'll have a pretty good sense, I think, within 48 hours of the race.
Boy, I hope you're right. Here's a question. We've had very vitriolic television ads and partisan dialogue. We've had crazy amounts of money raised and spent on these elections. Any chance that we will get to a system where the taxpayer funds elections and we can take all of this, we can better control the kind of the content of ads or ratchet it down and not have billions and billions and billions of dollars spent on these races?
I could answer this with one word and I'd say no, but I'll explain why. So in 2010, and I'm sure a lot of folks will remember this, the Supreme Court made the decision that corporations are people. It allowed super PACs to be formed. So if you're watching
Citizens United, right?
Yes. So if you're watching political ads, you will see in the particularly negative ones that they're usually funded by super PACs. And so with the existence of super PACs and the fact that they've been validated by the Supreme Court relatively recently, and ultimately it's an arms race really between the candidates. And so there's really no incentive for one of them to back down knowing the other wouldn't really want to do that or take any sort of pledge in that regard. So with no legal mechanism and no sort of personal responsibility mechanism to do that, I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. Whether or not, someone would propose that in Congress again, I can't see there being broad support for that. And that's the only mechanism really left there is for them to legislate about this. And that would require, the same sort of discipline that would be required for them to agree to term limits. And I don't, would you bite off your own hand kind of thing? I don't see Congress doing it.
Yeah. Let me ask you some questions that relate to portfolio positioning and kind of economic policy. Under the Trump administration and under the Biden administration, you've seen this massive increase in federal debt. Yeah. I mean, neither party has done a great job on this. And you listen to the candidates and they're either talking about further tax cuts or subsidies of housing, things like that. All of these policies further increase the federal debt. Nobody's talking about reducing the deficit. So how does that ever happen? And do we reach a point of no return where the service on debt, overshadows everything else?
So yes, and so do they do anything about it? No. And then yes, we eventually reach a point of no return and then they do something about it. So just to explain a little further, I was having a conversation with a former head of one of the finance committees in DC, and their view was, well, there's no reason to do anything about it right now. And what they mean by that is markets do not punish the debt and deficit. We had the debt downgraded in 2011 and markets reacted. We saw a change there, but then it happened just last year and there was no change. And so essentially markets are starting to price in the standoffs and the partisanship and the brinkmanship on debt and deficits. And the other thing I would say is that we are the global reserve currency, and that affords some flexibility there. So ultimately, until it becomes unsustainable, and that is perceived to be unsustainable by markets and government is punished, it's very painful to raise taxes. It's very painful to curtail spending. And so I don't see any incentive for them to do it.
Okay. How about the capital gains tax proposal where you're taxing unrealized capital gain? Now, I understand that is kind of directed at, people who make above $100 million or whatever. What do you think about that policy? Do you think it goes anywhere?
I want to talk about where it comes from, the political rationale for it, and then its prognosis and likely outcome. So where it comes from, Joe Biden released his budget proposal for the year ahead back at the State of the Union. Just after that, amongst his tax proposals was this unrealized capital gains tax. And Harris adopted a lot of Biden's proposals and tinkered around and made some changes. One of the things she just adopted was this unrealized capital gains tax. And it is called, and this gets to the politics, the billionaire's tax, because it is on people with over $100 million in assets. So I will just say, just taking a step back, whether or not this is good policy, it is good campaign rhetoric to suggest that you want to tax billionaires. It is motivating to a majority of Americans to think about taxing really, 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 really wealthy people. So I think that is where it comes from and why it's stuck around. I think, the Harris campaign could have taken a step back on it, but they didn't. But they also know that they don't have to put it in place and that there will be lots of opposition in Congress if she wins the White House to do that. Now, I think that would be true regardless of if there was a blue sweep. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer would never allow for there to be an unrealized capital gains tax. And there would be many, many others who behind the scenes would be saying, absolutely not. Now, that said, I understand, and I actually think that introducing a tax policy proposal, and now it's part of the lexicon. It will always be something that's discussed. And so I'm not trying to downplay the significance of it, but at the same time, I don't think it's politically viable at this time.
Yeah, I think it's maybe not only politically not viable, but logistically unimplementable.
Yes. Yeah.
For the same reason why I think it was in 2013 they eliminated step up in basis for estates when you die. Epically stupid idea, because then you're asking people to go back and get the tax records for property that they inherited from great old Grandpa Bob that don't exist anymore. I mean, just an epically stupid idea. So it could be, I think it'd be very, very, very hard to implement in practice. Yeah. We do have a couple other great questions. So here's a good one. What investment-wise, from an investment standpoint, what's a good action to take with portfolios? What's a good hedge?
So I am not an investment professional, nor should I be giving investment advice, because that's not my hat. But I would just suggest that not to take action in the lead up to the election, because ultimately, if you're thinking long-term, you really shouldn't be reacting to these moments where there's so much volatility. And, there are studies, and I don't have a link to them right in front of me, but I've seen so many of them this year, that if you remove or change your investment strategy and you miss just one of the best days of the year, just one, that you lose out significantly. So just reacting in the near term when you're thinking about the long term is just not something that I would advise.
Yeah, well, I am a financial professional and I do give financial advice. And so here's what I would say to that question. I would say, number one, the best hedge against risk typically is broad diversification. That's a step that we try to focus on with all of our clients to make sure that the risks that you take in your portfolio are intentional risks. Market risk is only one of many risks that you face. You face inflation risk, you face longevity risk, all kinds of risks. So we want to make sure that the assets in your portfolio really reflect your financial goals and get you to those financial goals with the least possible amount of overall risk. And the second piece of advice I would give is try not to focus on the short term. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. In the short term, you're going to see a new set of elections and a new government. But in the long run, what matters is what you are trying to achieve financially, what your goals are. And that doesn't happen over the next 2 years or 4 years. That happens over the next 2 or 4 decades, much longer time horizon. So focus on your goals and your plan. And that's why we at Quorum are here to help you with that. A couple other questions we have coming in. So with all the money spent historically, even more so this year, is there any communication channel like TV, ads, doing rallies, endorsements, whatever, anything that's a better bang for the buck than others? What's the most effective?
Yes, that's interesting. I think this is an unusual year. So, TV ads are still the basis of a lot of campaign spending, and you have to do it. Both campaigns are doing it. They are not seen to be particularly effective. If you poll people, they do not suggest that they've changed their vote or determined their vote based on a television ad. Now, that said, you still have to do it because your opposition is doing it. What has been really interesting to me this year is that both candidates have gone directly to their voters. So what do I mean by that? They have never invited until this year influencers to the RNC or the DNC, but both did this time around. So you have seen the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign very effectively go directly to folks who they think might be in their voting demographic and pitch their message directly there, or get those influencers who people trust to pitch that message. And we'll see, if either have done that more effectively. But I think that in this day and age, particularly if you're trying to motivate younger voters who consume a lot of their news and information on TikTok and Instagram and other social media channels, then you're much more likely, or podcasts, to reach them there. And, third-party validation and credibility is really important in influencing people's decisions. And so I think that's going to prove pretty effective for the campaigns this election cycle, and is arguably quite a lot cheaper than television ad buys, which are very expensive. Yeah.
Well, we'll see who's more influential, Joe Rogan or Taylor Swift.
Yes, absolutely.
With the amount of time you spend on the Hill in DC, are there any areas where you see bipartisan agreement?
Yes, I think it's interesting. Everybody has this perception, and I've probably given the impression that there are no areas where people agree in DC, and that's not true at a staff level. And I have friends on both sides of the aisle who've worked on every campaign that has probably happened over the last 25 years. And not only do those people get together and talk thoughtfully about policy at a staff and working level, there are senators and Congress people who meet in the middle on a lot of issues. And the two that come to mind that are most compelling in the next couple of years are mostly around new technology. So partisan feelings and views tend to be pretty well established on things we know really well. So things like oil and gas or clean energy, those things tend to be more partisan. Healthcare, those things tend to align a lot more neatly along party ideology. But there are new technologies always coming up, and people don't really have fully formed opinions on them. So you have seen some bipartisan work over the last Congress on regulating social media for the safety of children online. You will see, I think, more bipartisanship on the issue of cryptocurrency and bringing that into the regulatory perimeter. You have broad support across party lines, and you're starting to get more support even from folks who are further on the left to do something, because no one wants to fall behind in distributed ledger technology. And if we don't innovate and if we don't create a regulatory system where people can innovate, that's a real possibility. And then the final piece I would say is on AI in China. And so obviously artificial intelligence is really the next frontier and is going to bring about so much economic change and productivity gains. And the US knows that and does not want to fall behind from an economic standpoint on AI. But AI is also really strategically important from a safety and national security perspective. And so for that reason, you see a lot of folks on Capitol Hill attending in-person briefings, even at the senators level, to try and understand AI and then to work on solutions and come together to do something on that. And so I think we'll see more progress on those issues in the next Congress.
No, critically important. It's good to see that politicians are willing to put party aside on some topics, for sure. Last question. We've obviously seen a lot of negativity in the political process. What makes you optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's young people getting involved in politics and in DC as well. So, I've been in DC for on and off for the last 15 years. And you imagine, because the political environment has changed a lot, even in 15 years, that you wouldn't see as many people interested and excited and engaged and working on behalf of their constituency, their district. And you still see young people coming to be pages on Capitol Hill, to be interns, to work in congressional offices. And a lot of these folks are not just partisan, they really care about a particular policy or issue. And so I think that makes me optimistic that young people continue to be interested in our political system and willing to contribute to it. And, those are tough jobs. So I think it's great to see that people are still interested in doing that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Kari, I got to thank you so much. I mean, this has been really special. And thank you for doing it on Halloween, too. This has been a super treat, no tricks. And I wish you the best tonight in the candy collection process. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you found this equally as valuable as I did, and I hope you enjoy your Halloween. And gird yourself. 5 more days to go, and we're there. So thanks again. Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the Quorum Forum. Appreciate you tuning in, and see you next time.
Thanks, Kelly.